welcome to Fate of the Union. As always, I am your host, Franklin, and it appears again here in January 2021. We are going to go over, for a third time now on the program, the case of Kevin Cooper. If you'll remember from our initial episode and then when we followed up regarding the continued advocacy to try to get Kevin Cooper out of jail, Nicholas Kristof was really the originator of one of the most pervasive lies regarding this case, and we'll get into that in a second. That would be the three white men theory that has really permeated through every line of argument, every case of advocacy on his behalf. But I would again encourage everyone to go back and watch our initial episode on Kevin Cooper especially, and the follow-up. And again, I must say that everyone should go to Devin Tracy, Atheism is Unstoppable's Patreon, go on Alt Censored, wherever you need to find his videos on this case, which are especially good, even for Devin's track record, going through the facts of the case, the particular pieces of evidence, and what have you. So, for those of you just checking in, or really as just a brief refresher on the case of Kevin Cooper, I think it's worth going into a little bit of background about the family. Here you'll see the Ryan family if you're watching along on YouTube. The family was father Douglas, mother Peggy, and then the two kids were Jessica and Josh as the little boy. And you'll see here that on the particular night in 1983 when what's been dubbed the Chino Hills Massacre occurred, Josh's friend Chris Hughes, an 11-year-old boy that he was friends with, was staying the night. So the background of the case was that in 1983, the Ryan family lived in the neighborhood of Chino Hills, California. Chino Hills, over the years and really in present day, has grown to be a bit more upscale. There's still a fairly large ranching community. It's a nice neighborhood. But even back in 1983, it was a relatively nice neighborhood. The one pitfall to Chino Hills is that it is home to a very large prison, a men's penitentiary. And in that penitentiary is one of, if not the largest group of death row inmates, particularly male death row inmates. Now, on the night of June 4th, 1983, the Ryan family arrived home from a barbecue that they went to, and again, Josh's friend, Chris Hughes, was spending the night. However, after they returned home, their house was invaded by a man who proceeded to murder the Ryan family, again, later to come to be known as the Chino Hills Massacre. As we now know, with the exception of Josh Ryan, the rest of the family and Chris Hughes did not survive the attack. The weapons of choice in the attack included a hatchet, a knife, and an ice pick. Doug, the husband and father, was murdered in his dark bedroom. He was the first one to be killed by the intruder. He was stabbed 26 times and axed 11 more times, with wife Peggy stabbed some 25 times and another 7 times. Upon hearing the screams of their mother, the children ran to the bedroom. The next one to be murdered was Jessica Ryan. Her screams drew the attention of her brother and his friend, Chris Hughes. Chris Hughes was next. This man, the male intruder, slit his throat and he died. Josh Ryan was attacked last. The man knocked him unconscious, slit his throat, punctured his lungs, and broke a rib, and he was ultimately left to die. But miraculously, having some kind of survival instinct or some kind of presence of mind that really is pretty remarkable for a 9-year-old kid. You can see he's a very small kid here. He basically lodged his 4 fingers into his neck wound, and he survived. 11 hours overnight until Chris Hughes' dad came over the next day. He was worried that the family wasn't answering the phone. He wanted to check up on his son after the sleepover, and of course nobody answered. From there, the police were able to hone in on somebody who was likely staying at the neighboring house. The owner of the house next door to the Ryans, as you'll see right here, if you're watching on YouTube, the lower right hand of the screen, it was a vacated house to the extent that the owner was not actively living there. It was rented out. But when he came back, obviously he wanted to see what was up, with there being this terrible, terrible tragedy right next door. But when he got to his house, he noticed that several things were missing. Among them, an ice pick, a hatchet, and not to mention, it was very clear when he returned to this rental home here, neighboring the Ryans' home, that somebody was squatting there. Linens, sheets were being used. There were an ample amount of blood, other bodily fluids. It was very clear someone was taking advantage of the house being empty. So police were able to hone in on a suspect insofar as the suspect must have needed a place to stay. And even back in 1983, Chino Hills did not have a really large homeless population, so the cops were able to narrow it down for a suspect that needed a place to stay. It just so happened, in the recent days before the Chino Hills Massacre on June 3rd, 1983, there was an escapee from the nearby Chino Hills prison. Obviously, someone escaping the prison would need a place to stay. The man who escaped from prison was on record as a man named David Troutman. Now, that's an important name, David Troutman, and if you go back into the inmate booking photos, things like that, you'll see a man that looks like this here. If you're watching on YouTube, very large afro, scruffy beard, kind of a tall, lanky black man, younger black man. It just so happened that the man really known as Kevin Cooper had used the alias of David Troutman, A, to throw the scent off his trail after escaping prison the first time, and escaping law enforcement a series of times stemming from offenses in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, had to use the name David Troutman, a name that didn't have a criminal history attached to it. Now, we know that Kevin Cooper was later apprehended after actually sexual assault or rape on a woman on a cruise ship. He had fled the scene at Chino Hills and used another fake name to get a job as a deckhand on the boat in farther south in California. And the woman who was attacked by Cooper went to the precinct to report her attack, and lo and behold, the wanted poster for the man supposedly responsible for the Chino Hills Massacre was up and being displayed on the precinct, and she said that not only was I attacked, that's the man who did it, the man on that picture. Police eventually apprehended Kevin Cooper, and the trial went about as well as you would think for a man who has now had a series of crimes stemming from simple evasion of law enforcement. He has a statutory rape charge back from Pennsylvania, certainly the murders of the Ryan family, and now another rape in California to boot. Here's a brief overview at the evidence found in connection with this case. And I've separated into three separate venues, three separate locations for the evidence. That is the Ryan home up here on the upper left part of the map, their car, which was missing when police reported to the scene, so it at least had the appearance that someone had used a getaway car. That's number two. And number three, the rental lease home that I mentioned earlier. So let's give kind of a step-by-step breakdown of the evidence that was discovered. We'll start at the Ryan home, the place of the slayings. In and around the Ryan home, there were shoe prints. The shoe prints are important here because police discovered that the shoe prints were unique to Kevin Cooper in that the print and size were unique to the shoes issued to Chino Hills inmates. Now, the police already had an inkling, had a lead for an escapee of the prison because of the abandoned house next door. So the fact that we are now dealing with very unique shoe prints of the kind that would be worn by an escapee of the prison is definitely a central piece of evidence here. Along with that, I've placed at the home here at the top right Josh Ryan, the survivor of the attack, his consistent description that a darker-skinned man with an afro was the killer. This disproves the, quote, three white men theory, really the launch pad of Nicholas Kristof and then others, which we'll get to in a second. The Ryan family car used as the getaway by the man now known as Kevin Cooper, there was tobacco in the car, unique and only available to, again, Chino Hills prison inmates. You couldn't find this in retail stores. Even a homeless person who could have been on the suspect list wouldn't have been able to walk into a 7-Eleven, into a convenience store, and get this particular type of tobacco. There were also cigarette butts with Cooper's saliva on it. We know that because it was confirmed by post-conviction DNA testing. This is a particular shortcoming of the case on Cooper's defense and in his appeals that is never really discussed, never really talked about by his defenders, because there was a series of DNA testing actually requested by Cooper's legal team, and then wouldn't you know it, it all comes back and we have confirmed that it was actually Cooper's DNA. So that really was a very large egg on the face of Cooper's defense team, both during and again after trial. Cooper's hair samples, in a similar fashion, were confirmed to be unique to Cooper by two different independent experts at trial, which led to his conviction. Now we're going to get to the rental home. This is where the killer, now known as Kevin Cooper, was staying. Early on in his stay at the home, Cooper actually masturbated at the home, so of course left behind semen on a blanket there, and that was later discovered to be Cooper's. Knives and an ice pick were reported by the homeowner to be missing. We now know that that was two of the murder weapons used in the Chino Hills Massacre. The unique shoe prints were also found in and around the rental home. There were bloody footprints in the bedroom and the shower, and again, a hatchet, another unique instrument, but also a murder weapon, was missing from the home. Now, this was later found on the side of the road during the search for the suspect at large, and the hatchet actually had still on it hair and blood samples consistent with Josh Ryan and his father. So we know that that is an instrument, a murder weapon used in the massacre, but later discarded at a later date, presumably during the getaway. On the bathroom sink was Jessica Ryan's hair and threads or traces of cloth from her nightgown. That would be the daughter, Jessica Ryan. The unique prison tobacco was also found at the rental home. A bloodstained rope was found at the rental home, and call logs supported the argument that Cooper was staying at the rental home because if you trace the calls, it was later established at trial that Cooper was staying there and had made calls to female acquaintances to try to get money to kind of fund his escape. All of those female acquaintances turning down the offer from Kevin Cooper. Trial was interesting because the later claims of racial bias or racial animus, a targeting of Kevin Cooper, were not as present during the trial as you would think back in the 1980s. That's, in the overall view of the case, a more relatively new development in the desperation and increased Hail Mary attempts to try to get this man out of prison. In prison, because Cooper's DNA was at the house, because the call logs are unique, his defense team only had so much to work with. And in that, he himself, through his legal representation at trial, admitted that he was in this rental home in the days leading up to the murder. His contention is that by the day of the murder, he wasn't there anymore. He had fled, so anybody who went next door here and committed the murders, it wasn't him. Because the evidence did pin down Kevin Cooper at the rental home, so he had to basically play with the timeline of events in order for, again, some kind of desperate plea to get away from the conviction. However, we now know this was unsuccessful, and he was convicted. Cooper has had numerous appeals, evidentiary hearings in state court, appeals based on constitutional issues in the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, and while there have been some dissenting opinions, the majority, the controlling opinions in every court, have upheld the conviction of Kevin Cooper. Now, let's get to this New York Times piece here by Nicholas Kristof. It's titled, quote, "Is an innocent man still languishing on death row?" We know from a review of the evidence and of the post-conviction arguments that that answer is a resounding no, not in the case of Kevin Cooper. Here's a bit of a background, and we'll kind of take excerpts from Nicholas Kristof's piece here. When a neighbor arrived at the Ryan home on June 5th, 1983, to pick up his son from a sleepover, he couldn't process what he saw through the window. He thought all the red must be paint. We know that to be the various samples of blood splattered throughout the house as a result of the Chino Hills Massacre. Here's an especially important paragraph, quote, "The horrifying murder of a beautiful white family in Chino Hills, California, created enormous public pressure on the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office to solve the crime. Although Josh had indicated that the attack was committed by several white men, the sheriff announced just 4 days after the bodies were found that the sole suspect was Kevin Cooper, a young black man with a long criminal record who had recently walked away from a minimum security prison and then hid in an empty house near the Ryans." Now, if you go back and watch Devin Tracy's video series, which I, again, highly recommend, and you review the actual evidence presented in this case, this paragraph is, and with no equivocation can be forcefully said, an outright lie. Nicholas Kristof is the originator of this lie. Josh Ryan had not indicated that the attack was committed by several white men. This is absolutely not true. There was one claim made momentarily, several years after, that when visiting Josh Ryan in the hospital, he supposedly squeezed someone's hand when they asked if the people who did this were white. It has never been substantiated by a corroborating source. Josh Ryan says this never happened. That there's absolutely no substantiation, no credibility to that claim whatsoever. Josh Ryan has been adamant the whole time that it was not 3 white men at the house, but actually 3 Hispanic men at the house much earlier in the day than the massacre later that night. And even Josh Ryan had said, listen, these guys have nothing to do with it. I'm just telling you there were other people there earlier in the day, but we can rule them out. They were basically looking for landscaping work. They were looking to do some yard work, get some money, but they also similarly had nothing to do with this case. So the several white men theory, the 3 white men theory, is absolutely not true. This is a completely unsubstantiated tip that Nicholas Kristof has repeatedly promoted as absolute fact. It is, again, an outright lie. The sheriff announced just 4 days later, after the bodies were found, that the sole suspect was Kevin Cooper. Now, we've gone through why Kevin Cooper met the bill of a suspect description. We, A, needed a person who needed a place to stay. The abandoned home needed to offer refuge to whoever was staying in it. We know someone was staying in it because it had blood in it, it had the appearance of being disheveled, linens, food was used. Somebody was staying there. We now know that it was, by his own admission, Kevin Cooper was staying there. Again, sadly, a tan t-shirt believed to have been worn by one of the killers didn't produce enough DNA to provide a profile. Now, that part is true. There is a shirt that has inconclusive blood splatters on it, but we know that Kevin Cooper's particular DNA is at various parts of the Ryan home, the lease home, and the getaway car later found in the town where Cooper was apprehended. Here's another aspect, and you'll remember this if you go back and watch our original episode on here. Quote, this other suspect is a white man whom I'll identify just by his first name, Lee, for he must be presumed innocent. Lee is a convicted murderer who had completed his sentence and been out of prison for less than a year when the Ryans were killed. This is a man by the name of Lee Furrow. If you go back and watch Devin Tracy's video, this will definitely be a name that rings a bell. Lee Furrow, again, this is never, let's read this. Quote, Lee Furrow's girlfriend reported that he had returned home late on the night of the killings wearing bloody coveralls in a car that resembled the Ryan station wagon. But the problem with this is we know it wasn't the Ryan station wagon. We know that it was found in Long Beach, California, where Kevin Cooper had escaped to. So the fact that it may resemble the car, it may also be a station wagon, is now known to be totally irrelevant. We know where the specific Ryan vehicle was, and it wasn't with Lee Furrow. Additionally, the bloody coveralls, and this is of course something never mentioned by Nicholas Kristof. He just slyly says that the bloody coveralls were handed over to the sheriff's office and they threw them out without even testing them. So Nicholas Kristof again plays with the case to show that, well, they just rushed to judgment about him. They didn't even bother testing these bloody coveralls. They just threw them away. What he does not tell you is that Lee Furrow's girlfriend only gave them to the sheriff's office because, according to her and her friends having a witching seance and had some kind of illusion during the seance, that's what told them that these coveralls had blood on it, and that blood was from the series of events of Lee Furrow committing the Chino Hills Massacre. Now, I will tell you that a court of law will obviously see this as totally irrelevant, as unreliable. You can't connect something to a murder because some kind of vision, some kind of otherworldly supposed being told you that this was connected to the murder. So it was rightly discarded by Judge Huff during the series of legal proceedings, and rightfully so. Moreover, we know from subsequent interviews, both off camera and on camera with Lee Furrow, he had a pretty solid alibi. He was at a concert some 50 miles away from the Chino Hills Massacre in the days around the slayings of the Ryan family, and there's even strong indication that he had gotten a motel room with a female acquaintance, and essentially he was separate from time and place from being in Chino Hills, and he couldn't have possibly pulled off this terrible crime. There's growing recognition in the criminal justice circles that Kevin Cooper may be innocent. Quote, the San Bernardino Sheriff's Department framed him, William A. Fletcher, a distinguished federal appeals court judge, declared in a lecture. This is an absolute judicial malfeasance. Judge Fletcher did give a previous dissenting opinion on this case. This is wholly out of bounds for a judge to issue this kind of ridiculously speculative opinion, no less for a judge who oversaw one of the proceedings in this case. This is absolute malfeasance. And not for nothing, Judge Fletcher, who repeatedly in his opinions say things like, this could have been manipulated, this could have been planted, this may have happened. We are now some 30 some odd years after the conviction. We're not looking for may-haves anymore. We're not looking for could-haves. There is DNA evidence at various points that provide a very thorough and concrete timeline of events that pin it on one person, Kevin Cooper. So at this point, there's no more could-haves. There are no more maybes. Was it or wasn't it? Kevin Cooper, still decades later, cannot provide that evidence to us, and so the conviction must stand. Very noteworthy in this piece by Nicholas Kristof is that, of course, he doesn't mention Judge Huff. Her opinion, her writing on the case, of course, is not mentioned anywhere because she's not the kind of distinguished judge that Nicholas Kristof views William Fletcher to be. Throughout the rest of this piece, Kristof points to different individuals like Kim Kardashian and law professors who continue to speculate and provide their conjecture for why Kevin Cooper is not guilty of this crime. Additionally, he relies on the resistance of the San Bernardino County District Attorney's Office and law enforcement to test DNA. However, what he doesn't say that on numerous occasions, these subsequent DNA testing requested by Cooper's legal team, after it has already been proven beyond a reasonable doubt that he was in fact the perpetrator of these crimes, actually came back and solidified and confirmed him as the killer. So much so that the cigarette butts, which we spoke about earlier that had the saliva on it, in the Ryan station wagon, actually came back, and the district attorney's office and their independent examiner were able to come to the conclusion that this saliva is so specific, it's so solidly Cooper saliva, that it would match Cooper when compared to 19 billion other people. The second sample, for 1 in 110 million people, it is, without a shadow of a doubt, Cooper's saliva on these cigarette butts, on the station wagon, which was used to travel from the Ryan home to the town where Cooper was later apprehended. So, by Cooper's own DNA, we know, and by his own admission, he was in the rental home. We have his DNA in the Ryan home. We have the kind of cross-contamination. That's really a solid through line here. How did things from one house get to the other, and vice versa? There's prison tobacco at one house, there's prison tobacco at the other house. There's unique prison-issued shoe prints at one house, it's at the other house. Cooper's hair sample is on the car, it's also at the house, at the rental home. There was a carrier of that evidence between these three locations, and that carrier was, we now know, Kevin Cooper. Any desperate claims to try and justify any of this evidence as planted is further conjecture, really, again, originating from Nicholas Kristof. His journalistic malpractice and outright lies on this case has provided a great bedrock for people who do not look into this case, like the Kim Kardashians of the world, like the Young Turks, to kind of use this general outline you see here of the three white men theory, which is incontrovertibly untrue, of things like the lack of DNA testing. Never mind, we've gone through several rounds of additional DNA testing post-conviction at the request of Cooper's legal team that solidify him as the killer. Regardless of all that, this is the kind of general outline that you'll see the Young Turks, you'll see of Hollywood types when they get to anything resembling specifics of the case. They'll kind of use this general roadmap that was really originated with Nicholas Kristof. But I hope that this provides a better view of the case. This is kind of your home base for proving the case against Kevin Cooper. These kind of kind of lists bullet points for the home to various points of evidence found in this case. If you combine that with post-conviction DNA testing solidifying Cooper as the killer, and by Cooper's own admission being at the rental home at least up until the Chino Hills Massacre, you can clearly see that the perpetrator of the Chino Hills Massacre is one Kevin Cooper. There is one additional round of DNA testing that continues to be dragged out by the state of California, and we will, of course, keep everyone updated on that. At the end of the day, the current order from Governor Gavin Newsom, and likely even if this recall gets sorted out in a way that has him replaced, will likely stand in that although someone is on death row, the state of California as it stands today is not carrying out any execution. So in essence, Kevin Cooper and others like him really are effectively serving a life sentence. They are technically, as far as the paperwork and the inmate recording and documentation, yes, he is quote-unquote on death row, but as it stands now, he is effectively serving a life sentence. I want to end this video with a quick excerpt from a letter that Josh Ryan wrote to then Governor Jerry Brown. And he wrote it because at the time they were really starting this later round of DNA testing. And he wrote a letter to the governor's office in order to voice his opinion. And I want to read that to you all right now. And here's the letter. From Josh Ryan in April 20th, 2018. Dear Governor Brown, I was 8 years old. I lived on a ranch in Chino Hills with my family. We had horses and liked to ride and show them. We were a perfect family. Our house was filled with love. It was 1983. I invited my best friend Chris Hughes to spend the night at my house. If I had not, Chris would still be alive. I blame myself for what happened to him in the middle of the night. I heard screams coming from my parents' bedroom. I ran toward the screams. I tripped over my sister's body. She was lying in the doorway. The only things I vividly remember after that is lying in a pool of blood, being unable to move, and looking all night at my mother, who was lying dead beside me. The next morning I heard banging on the sliding glass door, and saw Mr. Hughes, and a look of shock and horror on his face that I will never forget. He left, and I heard the front door bashing in, and Mr. Hughes in the room cradling his son, and sobbing and moaning, which will always echo in my ears. I remember being put in a helicopter. I later learned no one thought I would survive. I tried to escape from Kevin Cooper by not reading the newspaper, but I could not escape his presence. I tried to get him out of my mind and banish him from my memory, but I could not escape. People will tell me he's on Facebook, puts on a monthly show from his cell in California. I think it's ridiculous. The California gives him everything he wants. It gave him the home at the Chino prison, which he climbed through to make his escape, which enabled him to murder my family and friend. We know about the hole in the fence that he escaped through because he later bragged about how easy it was to escape. California started subsidizing Kevin Cooper long before Facebook and his monthly talk show, when he made his way to my house to murder my family and friend and almost murder me. He walks in shoes supplied by the prison and smokes tobacco supplied by the prison. California has given Kevin Cooper everything he wants. He wants DNA testing, so California gives it to them. It proves that Cooper is the killer. So he says the blood was planted, and once more DNA testing, and for good measure, an investigation of the police for framing him because of his race. Kevin Cooper is a liar. He lies about everything. When he's caught in his lies, he lies more and more. He gets other people to believe in and broadcast his lies because Kevin Cooper. Because of Kevin Cooper, I was accused of being a liar on national television. CNN's Death Row Stories put on a show about Kevin Cooper, which presented his many lies as facts. The police framed him and coached me to lie under oath. Kevin Cooper is in my mind every day. The nightmare that plays over and over in my head. I can never get away from him. The latest is his request for clemency, something he rightly does not deserve. But he does not stop there. He also wants more DNA testing and an investigation of the police and prosecutors. This is ridiculous. It is obscene. Please deny Kevin Cooper's request, but please explain the reason why this time. Someone told the truth about what he did. It is time. Someone spoke up for me and Chris's family. Sincerely, Joshua Ryan. We now know that Governor Brown responded to this plea by granting Cooper's latest request for more DNA testing anyway, and the Supreme Court has affirmed even more DNA testing beyond that, to the delight of Kevin Cooper and his supporters. This is, at best, a waste of valuable judicial resources and puts victims like Joshua Ryan, seen here, in limbo, worrying that this man may be set free, in which case it is my personal opinion that his life is in grave danger. At worst, it sets a precedent for future cases to be overturned just by sheer speculation. I would implore everyone to share this video with people who may be interested in the case, and remember that we have the perpetrator of the Chino Hills Massacre. We do have him in custody, and this latest round of DNA testing will further prove that that individual is Kevin Cooper. Thank you for listening.